my line of work is, because I practice all over the state, and a good portion of it is concentrated in Evanston, but I also have cases in Chicago, Mount Prospect, all over the state. So I get to see sort of how different municipalities approach it, what works and what doesn't. And the first thing that I think Evanston really needs to consider doing here is, as kind of to piggyback off of something that John said, is that the Evanston RLTO, which works very well, is self-executing. But the problem with that is most tenants don't know their rights under the ordinance. And there was an attempt made to have landlords pass out a copy of the ordinance to tenants. But a lot of the landlords we're talking about, the problem landlords, don't give out a copy of the ordinance to their tenants. And that brings me to what my first suggestion, which is a right to counsel for tenants. I know this is somewhat controversial because of the concern that it will slow things down. But if you look at the municipalities that have introduced it, it actually does improve the quality of housing. New York City had a marked improvement in the quality of housing after a right to counsel was introduced. And let me explain why that is. As John explained, evictions are what we call in the business a rocket docket. Unless you know what you're doing, it's filed trial in 30 days. And the last study by Lawyers Committee for Better Housing found that landlords win 98.9% of eviction cases where a tenant is unrepresented. And most of those file reviews found landlords were not entitled to eviction orders in 98.9% of cases. That was just the result, because landlords generally have attorneys, tenants generally don't. Now, a right to counsel, what that does is, number one, it allows us to review these files and say, okay, maybe there is a habitability defense. Because remember, oftentimes what you're having is the Evanston ordinance allows a tenant to withhold rent under certain circumstances if things are not being maintained. So oftentimes what you have is the tenant withholds rent, then the landlord files an eviction, and the tenant doesn't know what to do from there, ends up getting evicted. So number one, a right to counsel is hugely important for improving the housing stock. Number two, and I agree with John about the problems with the licensing system. And this sort of piggybacks with a right to counsel, and that is a lease registration system. And it's something that the city of Tacoma Park in Maryland introduced to great effect. And it was basically three prongs. Number one, they said, you have to register the lease. In other words, there's an opportunity for the landlord to do it, an opportunity for the tenant to do it. And Evanston, because Evanston has the ERLTO, has an opportunity to pass out with a copy of the ordinance, dear tenant, you can register your lease here. So one of the things that Gail mentioned at the top was that we don't know really where the tenants are because the registry is incomplete. Well, if you're getting some information from the landlords and some from the tenants, you get a better picture. Number two, if the landlord doesn't register the lease, then they can't file an eviction case until they do. But what Tacoma Park found was the landlords would just do it anyway. And that's where the right to counsel comes in, because a tenant won't know to file a motion to dismiss saying, well, you didn't register, but a lawyer will. And what Tacoma Park did was it incentivized landlords to go and get that registration, because it took away their ability to evict the tenant in the event that it didn't happen. And between that and the right to counsel, now you have a disincentive for landlords to fail to maintain the property. And then on the third prong was the carrot. There was, here's the help for the small landlords, like John was saying, here's the help for the small landlords who maintain their property. And essentially what we're doing is we're creating a system where this isn't a license where we're going to force small landlords out and allow for slumlords who aren't going to pay for it anyway to keep operating. This is a registration, so it's more descriptive than prescriptive. And the reason I like this system is, number one, it tells you where the problems really are. Number two, it tells you where the tenants really are. And number three, it adds some teeth to the self-executing methods that are already in place. Like I said, the ERLTO works, but there are very few of us in private practice who are able to represent tenants in these eviction cases who know what to do and then are able to put the brakes on these evictions while we take care of this. One of the heartbreaking things about the eviction docket, and I strongly recommend, I agree with John here, everyone here should spend a day in eviction court. Because what you have is a largely white group of landlords and a largely black and brown group of tenants. And the tenants are not given the time of day unless they have an attorney. And yes, that is a flaw with the system, but it's also something that can be addressed with right to counsel. And it's been addressed to great effect in other municipalities with right to counsel. And the difference between a tenant saying, but my landlord's property isn't registered is hugely different than if the tenant's attorney is saying the same thing. And that happens because these dockets are huge. So in Skokie, for example, which is where most eviction cases from Evanston end up going, in Skokie, you have 2 judges who hear all the eviction cases. Sometimes there can be as much as 100 or 150 cases up at one time in one morning. And the call is so long that the call is so long that you have the eviction lawyers putting the orders of possession into the judge before the case is called to their pre-stamped. And then they get torn up if the tenant makes some kind of case. That's how much of a rocket docket it has become. So I strongly agree with John on that. I think a right to counsel is hugely important, and you tie that with a registry system, and basically you now incentivize the larger landlords, the slumlords as it were. They now have to comply, or the self-executing ordinance takes care of it. And Takoma Park saw a marked increase in how their housing stock functioned in a very short time. So I think that those are the 3 things that I have seen work. The one last thing, and I know I am short on time, the last thing I will say is licensing systems tend to be tied, and this is something Gail and I were talking about the other day, to crime-free ordinances. Crime-free ordinances sound great on paper, but they are universally considered unconstitutional by every attorney who has looked at this. The Shriver Center did a fantastic study a couple of years ago, and there's pending litigation in multiple cities, both in Illinois and other states about it. And generally speaking, there's yet to be a court that has upheld one as constitutional. And what they find is that's 2 reasons. Number one, a licensing system inherently favors the larger landlords over the smaller ones, and most of the slumlords you're trying to target with the licensing system just don't buy the licenses anyway. So then you end up evicting the tenants you're trying to help. And number 2, it creates a situation where you are discriminating against, whether intentionally or not, you're discriminating against Black tenants, brown tenants who are more likely to be victims of police violence and police calls without cause, and also women who are more likely to be victims of domestic violence who end up getting evicted because of those crime-free ordinances, because the licenses are now tied to to police activity. And so because I've never seen a licensing system that has been not tied to a crime-free ordinance, I tend to be very wary of any kind of scheme like that, especially when New York City, Takoma Park, other cities, Minneapolis has a similar one, have already shown how a registry and right to counsel system can work so much better.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us going, but you're a great segue to Jackie Koriath, who is going to talk about intended and unintended consequences of different strategies. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie. I work at the network. So for those that don't know the network, we run the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline. We do a lot of programs related to advocating against domestic violence. I'm the director of housing advocacy there. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you great people. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the intended consequences. I want to recognize that there's many good intended consequences regarding having oversight of the rental market. Currently the primary use here is to understand the depth of the rental market. I know Gail did a great overview of how it's currently working. I think we can agree it's not working necessarily as intended in terms of how the registry program is working. So as Evanston considers its next step for rental oversight, I think these programs are most commonly used to be able to effectively enforce property standards. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about today. One of the ways to do that, which could be a good intended consequence, is through inspections. So rental properties could be inspected more often. More often inspections usually leads to preventing minor code infractions from developing into bigger problems, just because you catch it early. It's a cheaper repair when you catch it early, and that's really helpful. I think there's also, the goal that over time, increased inspections under a program like this could result in safer housing stock overall. Just because with increased inspections, catching things, getting them repaired, it just over time makes safer housing stock. Another good intended consequence for Evanston is that these systems can gather data about where issues are happening and whether there's repeat problems. I know that's not an issue the current system necessarily collects, but it could. And so the system could be tailored to kind of collect data on that issues, which would give Evanston the ability to identify, track, and prioritize problem properties or problematic housing providers and take appropriate action. So one of the primary areas that I want to focus on is unintended consequences. So I think the first one and kind of the scariest one as we kind of think about implementing something like this is limited or decreased rental supply. Everyone wants to live in Evanston. It's such a nice place to live. So many people are trying to get into this community. So it can be really concerning to think about, well, what happens if the housing supply decreases or is more limited? Obviously the goal is to preserve good landlords and address problematic landlords and keep the housing stock that we have. We already have landlords that aren't paying the fees. Any additional fees or restrictions could cause rental supply to shrink because landlords could pull out of the process due to burdens involved or decreased profit, or just an inability to make repairs. Sometimes repairs are really expensive. That can be a big burden for smaller landlords. So at the same time, if there's a decrease in a supply or less landlords, demand for apartments won't decrease. We know that. So that could create increased rent prices, less available units, and it could also make more vulnerable tenants. Those with lower credit scores, someone with less housing history or credit history or employment history. And those are both common issues for survivors of gender-based violence. Or the other vulnerable tenants like those using a subsidy. It's already really difficult to use a subsidy in Evanston. Or those that are frequently subject to discrimination. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So for all of those vulnerable people, it would make it more difficult for them to find housing. Another unintended consequence could be housing affordability. So a lot of times when something like this is implemented, the cost of it can be passed through the housing provider to the tenant. So costs related to improving housing or coming into compliance could be passed through the tenant by increasing rental prices to replace the money spent on repairs. Landlords could also gravitate more towards move-in fees that aren't returned to tenants rather than security deposits. That's a process that's already happening just generally, just because there's so much restriction on security deposits. But they could do that to offset the money with respect to kind of repairs and additional costs. So certain restrictions could have a discriminatory impact based on how they're implemented. A lot of times I think provisions like this are enforced disproportionately based on race or national origin. That could drive diverse landlords out of the community. I think, when we're looking at a system like this with inspections and a lot of people involved in terms of people making complaints and people doing the inspections, we all have bias. And so there could be bias involved in that, creating a discriminatory impact when it's implemented. Going kind of further into these protected categories, these vulnerable populations of people, undocumented landlords or landlords with limited English proficiency might have difficulty understanding or complying with the new changes. I think there's ways to address all these things. I'm just kind of unpacking them all so that we can have a really rich discussion about it. Also want to highlight survivors of domestic violence are often re-victimized based on the acts of the people harming them. I would say one of the most common complaints that I've seen over years is damage to an apartment, where someone will come, the survivor might have an order of protection, the person comes and damages the unit, they might try to break down the door. Those are things that might come up on more oversight, and we don't want it to affect survivors for conduct that they're not causing. I think the last thing that I want to touch on is potential displacement of tenants. So if the landlord doesn't comply with oversight, well, what happens to the tenants, especially when it's a more difficult market to rent in? So Evanston could work to make sure that tenants are not displaced without some sort of recourse or assistance. Things I've seen is, potential financial resources, or, if you have a registry that's working and that's healthy, you might be able to connect people to new landlords coming into the system. One thing to do proactively about that, I think, is informing tenants as soon as possible when there's health and safety issues at a property. like when they're first raised, rather than at the very end of the process, so that if they need to prepare, they kind of have advance notice of that. That's just kind of an overview of all of them. I'm obviously very much in support of improving the system in Evanston. I just wanted to give a broad overview of what some of the consequences of that might be. Thank
That's
you,
great.
Gail.
That's really helpful. And I wanted to, the last sort of component of strategies before we move on to some additional ideas that come from the city council members is from Cheryl Lawrence of Open Communities, who's going to talk about landlord education.
Okay, there we go. Yes, thank you very much for having Open Communities at this forum. Thank you, Gail, and this forum together, and such, good strategies. And, we just want to add a little bit into the conversation to add another sort of proactive strategy, which has to do with mandatory landlord education. And, ultimately, what we all want is, stable housing for both, the tenant and the landlord. One of the best tools, to set landlord and tenants up for a successful relationship is really through training and education. And, there's several workshops that are offered throughout the year that renters attend, but it's a lot more difficult to get the landlords to voluntarily receive training. A lot of times it's as a result of a fair housing enforcement action or some other, type of, punitive feeling activity that forces them into this kind of training. And so, we really want to reimagine that. And, a benefit for mandatory training is the opportunity to create standardized training. So all landlords sort of receive the same type of training with the same content and can receive a certification for that. And, this would go a long way for housing organizations like Open Communities or Connections or other housing organizations to, give referrals to landlords, because, we know that they've been trained, in, how to be a good landlord. And, conversely, we're also working on, intensive training for renters and how to be a good renter. And that's something separate, but it's also a big part of this story. And, some of the areas that we've, identified that, we can look at in areas where landlords need training is, of course, in fair housing, eviction prevention and, tenants' rights and responsibilities, laws, codes, and regulations specific to Evanston, even things like ways to keep illegal activity off the premises, how to manage nuisance and conflicts, how to maintain a healthy building like bed bugs and mold, and that type of issue, how to handle reasonable accommodations and modifications, for, people with disabilities. A big one right now is, how to rent to students. What does that look like? How do you handle that? And how do you set those renters up for success? One other thing is sort of the benefits of accepting vouchers or other subsidies. Beyond the fact that it's illegal to discriminate for source of income, it's, part of that working is really changing the hearts and minds of, what landlords think about that. And, so these are just some of the areas that, if we made this, sort of mandatory, it's, and they have a certificate, it could be incorporated into the registration process, right? So they could upload their certificate along with their registration and say, and it's something that could be offered virtually off and on all year. We could do it in person, we can do it via Zoom. They get their certificate and they can, upload it and hand it in with their registration. So it's something that, can be a real positive influence, help educate landlords that, maybe don't have, opportunities to get this kind of in-depth education. And it also, will help too, again, in some of these other strategies that we've talked about before, like making sure that they have the EROTO handed to them and, all of those things. So it's kind of a bundle. So that's what we're proposing, and that's what we would like to see happen and, set people up for success.
That's terrific, Cheryl. These are all really great strategies. And at this point, we're going to move to the 3 council members who have also terrific ideas on the enforcement end. I also want to say on the outset that Sheryl Ring had talked about the issues with crime-free ordinances, and I'm really happy to say that that is not something that is on even close to Evanston's radar. So so kudos to the city for that. I am going to turn this over now to Council Member Reid of the 8th Ward, who will talk about just cause eviction protections.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Thank you, Gail. I certainly have to say thank you to the 2 8th Warders who were co-founders of Citizens Alliance for Better Government, both Oliver and Rick. Thank you for putting this together, and then Allie and everyone else who is a part of the CABG group. So I just first want to, ground us again as we go into this next phase of the discussion, right? To me, this discussion is about upholding the fundamental right to safe, affordable housing that all, Americans, regardless of their citizenship status, all folks in this country should enjoy. And I believe that right, that fundamental right to safe, affordable housing outweighs the right to a landlord, a residential property provider, or rental provider. It outweighs their right to make funds off of substandard housing or housing, period, that right to affordable housing. And so that's why I am really in support of measures that will reinforce that weight of balance to the side of the tenant and their right to housing. And that's why I support policies such as the just cause eviction ordinance that was touched on and explained quite well by some of the speakers earlier, that, this is a policy that would ensure that folks who are, face something as disruptive as having their housing uprooted are that happens with a just cause for a reason. And when there isn't a just cause, that, as was mentioned earlier, that there would be assistance in providing and finding relocated housing for those folks. And so really stand by that. I also want to mention, it was touched on, licensing was touched on quite a bit earlier. And I just want to reiterate what Gail shared there, which is that Evanston, the proposal that we're looking at around licensing is very different than what other cities have looked at. And it was mentioned that it was unconstitutional licensing, and certainly licensing that has warrantless searches, which was the case at previous cases that have found certain licensing regimes unconstitutional. That was the reasoning, was the warrantless searches. And that's also not what we're looking to do here in Evanston. So I think a combination of policies, increased inspections, a better regime to hold landlords accountable, a better regime to ensure that folks are evicted for just cause is the direction that we have to go in order to shift that balance. And I'll be brief because I'll want to make sure we leave a lot of time for public comment and discussion.
Thank you. It's so refreshing to hear you out there talking about a right to housing. It's very much appreciated. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Council Member Clare Kelly talking about strengthening fair housing protections.
Thank you. And thank you, the CABG group, for everything you do for Evanston, for the people of Evanston. And also thank you to the experts here, Gail and Jackie. I really appreciate, you really are the experts, and your interests and ours are in alignment. So I am very grateful to you for helping to figure out how to move forward in Evanston to make Evanston a place that really is more affordable. And that really, and I think, Jackie, you mentioned that, everyone's trying to get into this community. And I think you're absolutely right. So to me, it's really not enough to just say, we absolutely have to have affordable housing, and we have to have safe affordable housing. But I feel very strongly that we need to have affordable housing throughout Evanston. This is a beautiful town, and we don't want it to become a rarefied sort of, Greenwich, Connecticut, with just pockets, enclaves of segregated, economically segregated living. And so I did form this subcommittee of the Planning and Development Committee so that we can truly look into how to do that effectively, so that we really can look at ordinances and policies and enforcement so that we really do move forward with affordable living, dignified living, all over Evanston, not just in one ward, but in the 1st ward, in the 6th ward, in the 7th ward. So anyway, I just wanted to preface with that. I think that we're all on the same page, and I think it's so important. It's not just safe and affordable. It's really safe and affordable all over Evanston, and more of it. Not just, we really need to increase. As you mentioned, Gail, it has, our rental units have decreased. The fee for rental has just been distorted. More and more, it's become more expensive to live here. Even the price of homes have become, distorted because of a lack of policy. And it really does come down to policy. So I really think, I'm really happy to be working with Councilmember Reid and Councilmember Burns and Councilmember Revelle. And I think we really are going to move forward with some strong policy where we will see increased affordability throughout Evanston. I think that's really key. And okay, and I have, on the note of, I have moved forward. I've put through a referral to strengthen Evanston's own fair housing ordinance so that it aligns better with the, I think it was in 2019, that Cook County, the Just Housing Amendment for Cook County, so that, for example, I don't want to go into too many details for identifying factors, but a resident who was denied rental based on association with a family member who had a criminal background. And I was really surprised to learn that a landlord was able to actually turn this person down because of this. And researching this with Gail and others, I learned that we really do need to add to our own local ordinance, our fair housing ordinance. We can strengthen that. So I have submitted an amendment to strengthen that in terms of not allowing an individual to be discriminated against based on criminal background, but it doesn't mean that a landlord, it means it puts the onus on the landlord to really have to identify and prove that there is some risk involved. You can't just have a blanket, like in the case that I'm aware of with a tenant in the first ward where they were turned down. And that also includes things like you mentioned before, domestic violence, also everything that's related to victims of domestic violence, to really protect and ensure that tenants aren't discriminated on those sort of bases. So I'm happy to have put that forward, and I'm certain that this will be approved by council. And again, I'm really I encourage everybody to, if you can, to attend our subcommittee, our housing subcommittee of the Planning and Development Committee, in order to really look at all these issues surrounding evictions, surrounding tenants' rights, and really increasing affordability again throughout Evanston. And I also won't talk on too much, but I'm happy to answer more questions in detail. Thank you.
Thank you. And I wanted to mention too, one of the other amendments that you've that Evanston is considering is a right to repair, which is excellent, which is in HUD. It's not in Evanston's current ordinance, meaning that yeah, landlord can't discriminate against a renter who wants repairs.
Exactly. Thank you for mentioning that also. Yes.
And our last speaker before we move to discussion is Council Member Bobby Burns of the Fifth Ward. And I want to mention that Council Members Reid and Burns are both renters yourselves, which is also fantastic. You may be the only renters who are elected officials on a city council in the northern suburbs. Bobby,
Gail, yes,
thank you.
Gail, thank you so much again for working to organize this along with CABG, and as a member, I know you're a member also at CABG. Thank you for starting off with that, because I was going to start off with that to also ground the conversation. I want to preface this by saying I have an amazing relationships with landlords in the Fifth Ward who make it their mission to provide safe and affordable housing, and who want to maintain their property. Amazing relationships, contacts in my phone full of those landlords, and I speak to them on a regular basis. In fact, spoke to one not too long after this a little bit before this call started. But I do approach this also as a renter, somebody that has rented my entire life, someone or been in rental housing when I was younger, someone who was on the board of Open Communities, which for those who don't know is a fair housing organization and is a HUD certified housing counselor and enforcer of fair housing laws. I've been a board member, but I've also been a client of Open Communities, like the hair loss commercials, right? And so I've been targeted by predatory landlords and had to reach out to Open Communities to intervene in situations. In my role as a council member in Evanston, Open Connections for the Homeless recently shared some new data that said the Fifth Ward has the highest percentage of rental units. So that's also a lens that I'm approaching this with, is someone that deals with rental housing and landlord and predatory landlords on a regular basis. Since I've been in office, I have personally had to intervene in situations of someone being evicted for no cause. I've had to deal with countless issues involving housing choice vouchers and landlords. This shows you how much of this is just like a culture that has persisted for far too long, that I've had landlords comfortable to tell the alderman that if the tenant doesn't do something, that they're going to make them lose their voucher. I've had a number of landlords say that, and of course I respond with great disappointment and correct them. But that just shows you how much of a culture we have, both in Evanston, but I think it just everywhere, unfortunately, of predatory landlords. And so I just wanted to start off with that's the lens that I'm approaching this work with. And what I'm really concerned about is making sure that if a landlord repeatedly refuses to enter into remediation plans with the city, refuses to pay fines, refuses to maintain the property, ignores us, right? The landlord that was mentioned earlier that's involved in a lawsuit, both a lawsuit that I think tenants have brought, but also that the city has brought against this particular landlord repeatedly, right? I've had to deal with this landlord myself, just ignores any attempt from the city to address basic kind of or life and safety maintenance issues. And so I'm really trying to figure out, what do we do when that happens? And I think ultimately what happens is it ends up right in the court system. And so I've talked to our corporation counsel, one, about, do we have enough attorneys? Do we have enough staff in our law department to take these cases to court? Because the reality is that, and I checked with him on this, at least in the last 10, 15 years, we have not brought a lot of cases against landlords as the city of Evanston. And we have standing, of course, because it is our responsibility to preserve, health and safety in our community, and this and to enforce, make sure that our ordinances are enforced. And so we haven't brought many cases. And so I asked him, like, do we have enough staff to do it? He seems to think we do, which is a good thing. So that as we think about how to bring cases against landlords who repeatedly refuse to maintain their properties, I think right now, currently, we have enough staff to do it. These cases, as far as I understand, and the lawyers on the call jump in if I get something wrong, but they end up in I believe the Chancery Division or Chancery Courts. The Chancery judges are, in many cases, hearing things that don't involve personal injury. And so administrative review, for example, are cases that they hear, mortgage foreclosures, and, you know, they can order that fines are paid or repairs are performed. But again, what if those orders aren't adhered to? What are our options? And one option we've been exploring is this idea of receivership, which I think Gail was the first person that I ever heard bring up receivership, which is in law, receivership is a situation in which an institution or enterprise is held by a receiver, a person placed in the custodial responsibility for the property of others, including tangible and intangible assets and rights. And so, as again, in a situation where a landlord is repeatedly violating our ordinances and unwilling to make the necessary repairs, and let's say a court already ordered that they pay the fines and they that they perform the repairs and they don't do it, we could go back to that same judge and say, look, can we place this property into a receivership? I think for a lot of reasons, I like this idea if it's possible. We're still exploring it, but I think the fundamental reason why, and we've heard it on this call, is what happens to the tenant, right? If under a licensing or any other, even a registration, if we were to take someone's property or suspend a license, depending on whatever the scheme was, what happens to the tenant? What I like about receivership is it appoints a receiver that would not be the city. It would likely be a nonprofit in the city of Evanston. Thankfully, we have many options from HODC to SEPA to REBA to all types of affordable housing developers that currently own and maintain and manage affordable housing right here in the city. For instance, we're working with SEPA now in regards to our reparations work. I think we could very easily find a nonprofit to work with us on this. And then the property is under this receivership with a receiver that we know can maintain the property, can use the rents to make the necessary repairs, while the landlord determines whether or not they're going to sell the property or whether or not they're going to come back into accordance with our ordinances. So that's a bit of what we're working on. And as Councilmember Kelly said, I would encourage everyone to continue to follow these discussions, both in the Planning and Development Committee, but also in the Housing Subcommittee. Thank you, Gail.
This is great. Thank you, Councilmember Burns. And probably was fitting that we ended talking about receivership, because that is the ultimate tool, right? The ability to seize, or not seize, but to control a property to get it up to code, and put liens on the property of any any improvements that are made by a receiver. But at this point, these were all excellent presentations. Everybody had to talk really fast, so it's a good thing we're recording this and you can listen again. We wanted to just open this to all of you on the, in particular, the three of you on the council. If you had some questions that you wanted to ask of the experts, any clarification that you had. There's any questions, or for the other panelists, if there's a point you wanted to make that you heard somebody else say that you wanted to add to before we open this up to the audience.
Tina has a hand up.
Okay, I thought maybe we hear from the panelists themselves and then open for questions.
All right. Good.
Should I make a few more comments?
Yeah.
Again, I feel like what needs to be identified is, everything we're talking about is so important, but it's not going to have much importance if we drive all low-income people out of Evanston. And I think we really have to look at, I think there's been an issue with equity in the past, in terms of I can say pretty unequivocally that it feels like we have been pretty much catering to very wealthy landlords who live elsewhere, while we're not really supporting the way we should be our local small landlords, supporting existing housing stock here, naturally occurring affordable housing. And I think that's really important on many levels in terms of, again, spreading affordable housing out throughout Evanston, but also in terms of dignified living. These are landlords who live in the city, who live here, who care about the housing. And I think that's really important. I also want to say our inclusionary housing ordinance definitely needs to be revisited. When I look at review inclusionary housing ordinances across this country and in the state, ours is relatively weak. When a developer comes into town and they want to develop near, say, a transit-oriented development, they should know that we don't expect anything less than, like, say, 15% of those units, and they should be affordable, but truly affordable. And right now we have, I just want to say, in terms of everything that we're talking about, I can't separate it from access to affordability. I mean, as much as I am going to fight for tenants' rights, and I've submitted these amendments to our own fair housing ordinance, for example, Section 8, people who have Section 8 vouchers, there's almost nowhere to go in Evanston. And that needs to be opened up also. So I'm putting that out also to the experts, because I think this all goes hand in hand. We can't just speak in an isolated way about tenants' rights without also speaking to access. And currently, I mean, I would like to see our inclusionary housing ordinance also have a requirement for taking Section 8 vouchers. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. And also I want to, we have these, I'm sorry, the owl is going by, but many of the problems that we see are with these very, very wealthy landlords who live elsewhere, who have these portfolio properties, these LLCs. And I absolutely want to see us moving forward where we're really holding their feet to the fire. And that has not happened in terms of quality of living for the tenants that live there, in terms of affordability. And I'd love to hear from the experts here also on the best ways to do that. Can we have access to the actual owners of these portfolio properties, find out all the properties that they own, because we're finding that many of these properties are escalating in prices, that there's neglect, that the tenants don't live in, the quality of living has declined. So anyway, those are just a few points I wanted to add.
Yeah, thank you for adding all of that, Claire. And actually, I think that's a good segue to Cheryl Ring, who has her hand up. I know that Sheryl, you have some ideas about the whole LLC issue.
Yes, I do. And you and I talked about this the other day. So I think that was so I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but right to counsel. And here's sort of where this comes in. So the way, if you look at how a civil Gideon versus Wainwright is the case that says you get a right to counsel, a civil Gideon is your right to counsel in certain cases. So what a lot of cities or states that have put in place a civil Gideon for certain instances, like evictions, have done is they've said that the filing fees that get paid, they go into affordable housing. In other words, when the landlord is filing an eviction, they are actually funding affordable housing by doing so. And that way, because now you have two sets of filing fees, right? So you have because whenever there's a lawyer, you have to file an appearance and there's filing fees and that kind of thing. So I think that and right to counsel really does level that playing field, because when you have those out of state landlords, and I can tell you this from experience, because I'm in Skokie all the time to do, like, every week to defend Evanston tenants in evictions. So, and what happens is you have a representative from the landlord who's not the owner show up with the lawyer, and most of the tenants are unrepresented. The best way to prioritize local landlords is to make sure that the landlords who are not local can't steamroll tenants. And you can turn the right to counsel into a revenue generator for affordable housing. And if you look at the New York City is a fantastic example. What New York City has done with their right to counsel ordinance is they actually were able to turn it into a revenue generator for affordable housing and rent control. And so the Evanston RLTO is a variation of the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act that was created by the folks who make all the uniform laws. And the first draft was back in the 70s, but a lot of these provisions were proposed even back then. And just like Chicago and Mount Prospect did, Evanston took a couple of provisions and put them in to make the ERLTO, but left a lot of that other stuff out with respect to affordable housing. And so a lot of this stuff has already been drafted by the folks who do uniform laws, and it's already on the books in most of the West Coast as state laws, and in Colorado, and now in New York City. And I think that the right to counsel really does have a lot to do with that. The other thing I wanted to mention was about receiverships. One thing that I am seeing more and more of is banks issuing predatory loans to landlords. And the reason I bring this up is I always look at this, and yes, I am biased because I represent tenants in my practice, but I always look at this as a kind of like you were saying, Claire, how do we keep tenants in their homes? And what a lot of banks have started doing is putting provisions in the mortgages that say if the tenants unionize or the landlord starts dealing with the tenants, the bank can call the loan. And this was something that was completely foreign to me until a couple of years ago. I was working with a group of tenants who were unionizing, and we were on really good terms with the landlord. And the landlord said, but there's this one provision in our mortgage. And I took a look at it and I almost had a heart attack. And one of the things that I found is this is primarily in loans that are given to Black and brown landlords who are trying to build generational wealth. And they put it in an assignment of rents rider. And it basically says that at any point, if the bank feels that their investment in the property is in danger, whether it's through the tenant not paying rent or the landlord not charging enough, the bank can come in and take the property over and send a default notice. So my biggest concern with receivership, as a litigator, I love the idea because I've done receiverships as a tenants' rights lawyer, you end up doing those things. But one of the things that you have to be sure of, and you have to make sure that goes into the ordinance is, what happens to the bank in that situation? How do you make sure that Evanston is ahead of the bank in the line of priority? And so when you're looking through all of this stuff, I would recommend that there be some kind of language, even if it's just a line or two, that says that the bank cannot use a protected right as a basis for default, just so that the bank can't come in the middle and say, oh, actually, the building's ours now.
This is excellent.
Thank you.
This is all
Yeah.
stuff I have to admit that I didn't know before I talked to you. We'll go to Devon, and then John, and then
Actually,
we'll go to-
John was up before Devon, but.
Oh, John. Okay. Thank you.
I was just wanting to say two things. One is you could also make that part of the registration, is that landlords have to identify all major owners, anybody that owns more than 7 or 8%, and then make that very available to all the public and all that. So I think that'd be one way to also deal with these LLCs, because they are certainly a problem. The other little maybe low hanging fruit that the committee might want to take on is just that the Cook County just recently passed a tenant and landlord ordinance, and they actually have some stronger provisions now than Evanston. I mean, Evanston led the way, I think, with the first landlord tenant ordinance in the area, but now there have been other cities in the Cook County that have passed it, and I would encourage everybody to kind of look at that. Particularly, like one of the things is that now, instead of a 30-day notice, landlords have to give a 60-day notice, both to for big rent increases and to get rid of a tenant, which just seems fair. Is you need that more notice. So I would just encourage everybody just to review that and see what you can just bring straight in. It's already written, so that's it.
John, thank you. And let me say that we have limited time. We've got about 12 minutes. All of the comments have been excellent. We're going to get Tina. And Tina, if you would kind of condense. Who?
This is Devon. I did have
Devon,
one.
I'm sorry, would you go on, please?
Yeah. I had
And kind of condense it, if you will, for us.
Yeah,
please.
I don't have a big, proclamation or statement here. I just have some quick questions. So one,
Okay.
I guess the one proclamation is certainly I agree with. I'm looking for the name now. My apologies. Jesus Christ. Well, I agree with the attorney who spoke about the right to counsel, essentially the civil Gideon that she mentioned there. I totally agree with that. I've in fact made a referral about similar a civil Gideon, essentially, in other cases. I didn't particularly target rental, but I've one question about that is, how does New York pay for that? And I wonder if their system is set up a bit different than ours as far as their court system. And then secondly, how do we hold, you said you're involved in this, you probably know the landlord. I live right next door to a building that is owned by one of Evanston's most notorious negligent landlords. And how do we hold folks like that accountable? Because if we don't have, for example, for the folks concerned about licensing, if we don't have a license, how do we stop these folks from, perpetually renting low quality substandard housing? How do we take that right away from them?
Attorney Cheryl, can you respond to that after? Let me get Tina, and would you respond? Because Tina, if you would make it kind of brief, and then we'll have you respond, Attorney Cheryl, to Devon's question. Tina?
Hello,
Hello, yes.
can you hear
Tina.
me?
Yes,
Hi.
we can. Hi there.
Okay, I'm Tina Payton. Many of you know my story. I'm going to say it again briefly. My family has provided affordable housing for over 50 years here in Evanston. I've been managing myself for almost 23 years, and we have, for all of our time, have rented most of our units to affordable housing, Connections for the Homeless, Center of Concern, Catholic Charities, Trilogy, and many more. So persons like me feel very slighted, and perhaps next time you will include a perspective of a landlord. Since the pandemic, we have not received any help from the city. We never get any support from the agencies. We never get any support from organizations like yourself. And you only focus on the bad landlords. So what happens is that your housing stock will be less and less, because I'm not going to be able to afford to provide the units if I'm not getting any support. As you know, very high taxes here, and very high maintenance costs, because there's many buildings that are being purchased by REITs, the Real Estate Investment Trust, sold for high amounts of money, like the Reserve was sold for $65 million last year in November, and 1717 Ridge was also sold for $71 million at the same time. Those landlords, what you're discussing will not apply to them, because their rents start at $2,000 a month. So therefore, the burden falls on the small landlords that doesn't have as much money as these large complexes. And
Tina,
so I would like to hear.
Tina, in deference to questions, your points are all well taken. Could you address your question and let us respond to it? And then we can get
Well,
back with
I would like to know what is your plan for helping small landlords like myself, and also have you identified the landlords that are doing the right thing, and not just identifying the landlords that are doing the wrong thing? And what incentive do you have to bring more affordable units, or get other landlords to take affordable units, the vouchers?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's ask Attorney Cheryl, would you address Devon's question first, and then let somebody on here, let's get the 3 or 4 questions that Tina has, and then we'll turn it back to Gail because time is nigh. So let's get Attorney Cheryl, would you address Mr. Reid, Councilperson Reid's question?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question, Alderman. You can. I know we're short on time, so I would be happy to continue this discussion with you by email or chat also. But very briefly, there are several different municipalities that have done a right to counsel, and they all fund it a different way. A lot of it is with appearance fees. One approach that I really like is the more evictions you file a year, the higher your filing fee is. And as a result, the filing fees end up paying for the civil Gideon. Also, a lot of these evictions are less expensive than you might think. And as far as the civil Gideon is concerned, you can farm it out. A lot of municipalities farm it out to private attorneys or say, here, we'll pay you $100 to represent everybody in court on an X day. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Different municipalities have different approaches. They all work. Even any attorney is better than none. As far as holding the landlords accountable, I can say with 100% confidence, the landlord who you're talking about, where I'm already suing. But the biggest issue that I had, and again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but most of the clients who came to me about this particular landlord were like, we didn't know that there was an attorney available who took this kind of case. Because the reality is, for a lot of low-income tenants, they are either scared to rock the boat, or they're worried that they will become unrentable to somebody else because of the stigma that's attached to an eviction, and because of the threats that these landlords make, and also a lack of resources and education. That's something that Cheryl Lawrence was talking about, that the need for education is so important for tenants as well as landlords. So I think accountability comes from the city, but I also think it comes from the city giving tenants the tools to hold their own landlords accountable through things like a civil Gideon. Just being able to file a counterclaim for failure to maintain the property, and it also I think that kind of thing helps. It shows that there is an investment by the city in making sure that tenants are protected, and so the city doesn't have to necessarily. The city doesn't have to rely on the overtaxed city. The city can give tenants the tools to also help themselves. But like I said, I'd be happy to continue this discussion by email or by phone if you wanted to give me a call or an email. And thank you very much.
Attorney Sheryl, thank you so much. I'm going to ask Ms. Schechter if she would bring closure, but I'd like to also suggest to those of you who had questions, who had information in the chat area, Ms. Schechter will, I'm sure, get the questions together, and maybe we'll have somebody on this call respond to them. And we're going to try to have a subsequent meeting as a follow-up so we can maybe address these questions later. So, Ms. Schechter, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Since this is a meeting that's also subject to the Open Meetings Act, we just want to ask if there is any other member of the public who wanted to write a question. Just putting it out there.
Gail, I don't think anybody answered Tina's question.
Oh, we didn't, right.
Yes.
Right.
I was just about to bring it up, and council. My suggestion would be Councilmember Reid, because he's working on a working group that is addressing this issue. If he could quickly provide an update of that working group.
Yeah. We're is this the well, so many committees. This is the Housing and Community Development Committee. It's a subcommittee of that committee or a task force that is working on providing assistance for small and medium landlords, medium-sized residential property providers. I hate the term landlord. I think it's an antiquated term. I'm trying to get it out of my own lexicon now. Let's all try to get that antiquated term out of our lexicon. But so yeah, we're working on that, and we'll be having a survey going out next month if the committee approves it, and then we'll hopefully have some kind of program ready by fall for introduction and for community member, or for small and medium-sized property residential property providers to apply for.
And Devon, can you quickly define what is, at least right now, what's being discussed for small and medium?
Right now, a small landlord, it would be defined as any or small property owner would be someone who has 1 through 15 rental units, residential rental units, and a larger residential rental provider would be someone who has 15 through 30 or 16 through 30 units.
Thank you so much, Councilor Reid. Ms. Schechter, Tina, did that address your question?
Well, I know about that. You know, that's like not soon. You're discussing what other incentives do you have to make people want to take the voucher, because you're talking about forcing, okay, which is already on the books that you're supposed to. But the problem is the luxury landlords get to
That's
escape.
a separate unit or a separate issue from, I think, the question that you raised.
That's what I'm trying to get the answer. That's what I'm asking. It's a separate question.
Okay, would you communicate with Councilperson Reid and work on that? And then Ms. Schechter, would you also see if there's somebody on here who can address her question later on, not now, but after this meeting?
Yes, you might, Tina, you might also talk to, well, John Bartlett had some ideas. These are more like potential ideas for the city as opposed to help right now. But I actually see Councilmember Kelly. I don't know if you wanted to add.
Just a quick comment. I mean, small landlords, local landlords really did get hard hit during the pandemic, worse than our larger, wealthier landlords. And I think it really is incumbent on us and maybe our subcommittee of the P&D I think we should be allocating ARPA resources to support our small landlords. I mean, this is what builds our community, makes our community stronger. These are landlords who care about their community, about their neighborhoods, and about their tenants, and have great records. So I feel very strongly, and I hope to see us move forward with making allocations to support our local small landlords. Or medium.
Just really quickly, Councilmember Kelly, I just want to say there is a line item in ARPA right now, and I can send it to you tonight, that we've already set aside funds for the program that is being discussed in the task force that Devon just talked about. So what you just described is happening currently, and I'll send you information on it. So it's already being worked on in the HCDC committee.
Great. I'll look forward to seeing that executed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councilman Burns. Appreciate it. Last question is from Ms. Price. Then it's definitely going back to Ms. Schechter. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Discussion actually flowed right into this question, and that has to do with the right to defense, not only for landlords, but also for homeowners. And we know what can happen if someone thinks receivership is going to help the city, but it's actually helping someone who's trying to do wrong to the person, like bad tenants, to the person who is being abused. So we need to really look into carefully and have things worded that the ordinance clearly state about the rights to rebut or to disprove the allegations against them. And if you go into adjudication, that's not given to you. So we all need, whether it's the adjudication court locally, or it's going to Cook County, or it's going to the Chancery, we all need to be defended by an attorney. And I speak from experience. So thank you. And also gratitude for those helping me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Price. Thanks to all of you. Back to Ms. Schechter. Thank you all.
Thank you. This was such a rich hour and a half. It went by so quickly. I want to let you know that many of the panelists have shared data and documents and books that they suggested people read. So as a follow-up, Community Alliance for Better Government will make that available. And I just wanted to actually quickly turn it, I guess since Councilmember Kelly, since you're the chair of that committee, what is the next step? Just for everybody to know.
Yeah, so we've been in a debate. We're pretty, there are four of us. We're divided on licensing and registration. So because of our impasse there, essentially because of that, that's going to go to planning and development. That discussion regarding registration versus licensing. We'll look at caps. We hope to redefine, caps, the definition of family, whether we redefine it, amplify that meaning, and look at house limits. We know that very often what's happened is rents have been distorted because of the creation of student housing, where we see, landlords collecting $10,000 to $15,000 a month, actually all over in the first and the fifth ward, creating student housing, unregulated student housing. So it's looking at that, but it's also looking at that in terms of how we can, create more affordability and also addressing student housing. So that's next on our docket, but always under the umbrella of creating more affordability for our Evanstonians. So that.
Thank you. And of course, we hope that all this information that you learned tonight will add, a new dimension to the conversation, because from our perspective, it's not about registration versus licensing versus, proactive inspections or rights of counsel. It's all the umbrella of how do we best protect our renters in Evanston, especially the most vulnerable renters, and how do we increase their numbers in our city. And on that, it's wonderful to see everybody on the same page. So with that, I think we're done for the evening. I am going to just quickly share before we close, just because I realize that there are people who are on Zoom or Facebook. This is contact information for everybody, just so that you have it. You can take a picture of it or just let us know. evanstoncabg@gmail.com if you have any questions. So with that, Rick, are you still here? Turn it to you.
No, I'm still here. I just wanted to thank everyone for being a part of this program. I thought it was extremely informative. And this is the kind of work that we want to do as an organization, of educating folks, having this type of positive dialogue to learn more, connecting with our city leaders and our community experts. And this is exactly what we've been trying to do as a community alliance for better government. So thank you all for being a part of it. Gail, absolutely great job of kind of putting this all together and coordinating. Oliver, thank you for facilitating, and thanks to the leadership team at Community Alliance for Better Government for all the work that you do, and council members. Come on, a great evening. So enjoy the rest of the evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I guess we have to officially, the meeting is.
The meeting is adjourned. There's no further business before us.
Yeah.
Have
All
a
right,
good evening, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Great evening.
Good job.